You weren't always the person you are. You practiced your way into her. Picture a woman saying, "I can take care of myself." Not defensively, not proud, just as a fact. "I'm used to handle things myself. I don't really need much from other people. I don't like depending on people." And maybe all of that is true, but maybe it's also learned. Maybe it didn't begin as personality. Maybe it began as adaptation. A way of staying steady, a way of staying functional, a way of staying emotionally intact. Inside situations where too much openness would have made everything harder. And over time, what protected you started to feel like who you are. Not something you learned, not something you built. Just, this is me. Psychology has known for a long time that people adapt. Not just in what they do, but in how they come to experience themselves. And here's the part that tends to surprise people. That process doesn't feel like change. It feels like clarity. When a way of functioning becomes practiced enough, repeated enough, relied upon enough, it stops producing the small friction it once did. The effort disappears, the self-consciousness disappears. And what's left feels less like a skill you developed and more like a person you simply are. That shift is not pathology, it's not damage. It's actually one of the quieter, more elegant things the human mind does. But it raises a question. At what point did what you learned to do become who you believe yourself to be? What repeats long enough starts to feel like self. That is what this episode is about. The moment adaptation stops feeling like adaptation and starts feeling like identity. Welcome to Psychologist for Escorts. I'm Eva Valora, and if you do this work or have done it, this is a place built specifically for you, for what you carry, for what you navigate, and for what you deserve to understand about yourself. In the last episode, we looked at narrowing, at what happens when emotional efficiency reduces variability to the point where the range of experience begins to flatten, where pleasure arrives at a lower volume, where connections become slightly more managed. We ended with one question left open. What happens when this process goes deeper? When efficiency doesn't only narrow experience, but begins to reorganize the way you understand yourself. When it stops being something you do and starts being who you are. That is where this episode begins. Identity is not fixed. You are not born a blank slate. There are innate tendencies, temperamental differences, a nervous system with its own predispositions. But identity itself develops through repetition, through environment, through adaptation. Every time you respond to a situation in a particular way, the system registers that. Not consciously, physiologically. The nervous system pays attention to what keeps you stable, what keeps you safe, what reduces friction. And when a response works repeatedly, the system begins treating that response as important. The nervous system organizes around what works repeatedly. What repeats enough times becomes faster. What becomes faster becomes automatic. And what becomes automatic eventually stops feeling like behavior and starts feeling like natural. This is how adaptation slowly becomes identity. Not because the original adaptation disappears, but because awareness of the adaptation disappears. And once awareness disappears, the nervous system stops experiencing it as This is something I learned to do. It experiences it as, this is simply who I am. This is especially important to understand in high-end escort work. Because the work doesn't only ask for behaviors. It asks for repeated emotional positioning, repeated regulation, repeated composure inside intimacy, repeated one-directional attunement. And when something is repeated under emotionally significant conditions, the nervous system learns it very, very quickly. Not as theory, as baseline. The system begins assuming this is how connection works. This is who I need to be inside intimacy. And eventually, the role stops feeling like a role. The regulated self becomes more dominant, more automatic, more available than the spontaneous self underneath it. This is how identity forms, quietly, physiologically, one repeated pattern at a time. And when it settles, it doesn't announce itself. It simply becomes the answer to the question, who are you? Maybe you are always the stable one, in every group, in every relationship, in every situation that becomes difficult. You're the one who doesn't panic, the one who stays composed when others don't, the one people can hold space inside of, without needing space held for you. And people respond to that. They trust you, they feel calmer around you. You became the calm in every room you entered. And over time, the nervous system notices that reinforcement. Being the stable one stops feeling like a role. It starts feeling like identity. Not like I regulate, but I'm someone who holds everything together. And there is truth inside that. You really can hold things together. That capacity is real. But what becomes invisible is what it costs to always occupy that position. Because when someone becomes psychologically identified with being stable, they stop expecting support. Not consciously, gradually. The body remains quietly organized around, don't become too dependent, don't become too emotionally exposed, don't fully let go of control. What protects you repeatedly eventually starts feeling like who you are. And this becomes especially powerful in high-end escort work, because the work consistently rewards composure, regulation, containment, emotional management. So the nervous system learns stability keeps everything functioning. And eventually, the self reorganizes around that stability. Not only professionally, personally, relationally, being emotionally reached starts feeling unfamiliar. Someone tries to care for you deeply, and something inside remains slightly back, observing, managing, still composing. Not because you don't want intimacy, because the system has become more practiced at regulating intimacy than receiving it. The more composed you appear, the less people sense your need. And eventually, you may stop sensing it yourself. The regulated self often becomes invisible to itself. I didn't know how to be vulnerable. Not because I was afraid of it, but because it didn't feel like me. When I tried, it felt wrong. And I told myself that was just my personality, that I was someone who handled things herself, that I didn't need that from other people. But the truth was, I had been the one handling things for so long that not handling things on my own felt like a threat. Not to my pride, to my sense of who I was. That's worth paying attention to. Not what I fear to lose, but where I felt the threat. When regulation becomes identity, certain experiences become difficult to access. Not because they are gone, but because the identity doesn't have room for them. Women who reach this stage are not numb. They aren't disconnected. They aren't broken. They are functioning, often functioning very well. The first is uncertainty, not the practical kind, the deeper kind. I don't know what I feel about this. I don't know what I want here. For a system organized around always having a response, uncertainty is not an experience to be had. It's a problem to be solved, quickly, or avoided, or passed before it is fully felt. And you move on, capable, composed, slightly further from yourself than you were a moment ago. The second is need, not the practical kind, the relational kind. The need to be seen, to be held, to have someone else carry something for a while. For a system that has learned to regulate without reciprocity, that kind of need feels unfamiliar, foreign even. Like reaching for something you aren't sure you're allowed to want. And so it goes unexpressed. Not because the need isn't there, but because expressing it doesn't feel like you. The third is spontaneity. To love before considering how the love lands. To feel something and simply show it, without the subtle internal check that asks, is this appropriate here? Is this consistent with who I am? For someone whose system has spent years ensuring that what comes out is correct and readable, authenticity has become something you produce, rather than something you simply are. Across these three areas, uncertainty, need, spontaneity, the same pattern appears. Not loss, inaccessibility. A practiced distance between the experience and the response to it. Intimacy changes quickly, not from wanting distance, from falling into pattern. My partner told me once that being with me was sometimes confusing. Not because anything was wrong, but because I was impossible to find. Always managed, always stable. And he said, I never know if you actually need anything. I didn't know what to do with that, because from my perspective, I was being strong. I was handling things. That was what closeness looked like to me. But what I heard underneath his words was something I didn't have a name for yet. That my stability had become a wall. Not protecting me from him, protecting me from needing him. This is one way the cost shows up in your identity, in the space between two people. But there's another way, a quieter one. It shows up when there is no one in the room at all, when there's nothing to manage, nothing to stabilize, no one needing anything. In my early 20s, when I was a full-time university student and full-time sex worker, I went on holiday to Indonesia. For the first time in years, I took 2 weeks off. And within a few days, I was studying. Not because I had to, not because exams were coming up, but because without something to work on, I didn't quite know what to do with myself. Not practically, internally. There was nothing to manage, nothing to stabilize, no one needing anything from me. And the freedom of that didn't feel like freedom. It felt heavy. Even the beach couldn't touch it. Even the luxury of having nowhere to be couldn't reach whatever was underneath. Like something was missing. And I realized that what was missing was the structure that told me who I was. Without something to handle, without a role to fill, the quiet felt very loud. I just described 2 different situations. One with my partner who couldn't find me, one alone on a beach with nothing to manage. In both, the same thing is missing. Not connection, not purpose. The ability to simply be, without organizing myself around something. There's a particular cost that comes with being the stable one. It's rarely named because from the outside it looks like a gift. But there's a weight to it. Not the weight of what is given, the weight of what cannot be received. When stability becomes identity, receiving becomes difficult. Not because you don't want what is offered, but because your identity doesn't quite know what to do with it. Care arrives and the system deflects it, minimizes it, redirects it back. Not from pride, from something more automatic than that. A subtle, practiced sense that being cared for is someone else's role. The Indonesia story makes that visible. I had 2 weeks, a beautiful place, no situation that asked for performance. And my system went looking for something to organize around, automatically. Because when the structure that tells you who you are disappears, even temporarily, the nervous system experiences it as groundlessness. Not rest, loss. That response, reaching for structure when structure disappears, is one of the clearest signs that the identity has become dependent on functioning, on usefulness, on having something to manage. It means rest doesn't fully restore anymore. It means holidays can feel heavier than work. It means the moments that were supposed to be for you are often the moments where you feel most unmoored. And eventually, something becomes exhausting that was never supposed to feel like work. The continuous background level composure. The part of you that never fully puts itself down. A part that stays back in every moment of closeness, observing, managing, composed. Even when love is real, even when the beach is beautiful. And the cruelty of it is that it doesn't feel like a cost. It feels like who you are. When the nervous system can no longer access the option to put something down, strength stops being a capacity. It becomes a cage. A very elegant, very functional, very invisible cage. But a cage nonetheless. And it travels into the ordinary moments, the coffee, the conversation, the casual question about your weekend. My classmates told me things, their relationships, their fears, what they struggle with, and I listened. I was genuinely interested, but I never gave anything back. Not because I didn't want to, but because I couldn't. I had a different name, a different story, a different version of who I was that I had to keep consistent. Every conversation, every coffee, every casual question about my weekend. And after a while, the lying became the most exhausting part. Not the work, the lying. Because the work had its own intimacy. People were close to me there, in their own way. But that closeness wasn't mine either. It belonged to the name I used there too. So I was never really known, anywhere. And the strange thing is, I got used to it. It became the texture of my life. This quiet that nobody else could hear. I could light up a room, be fully seen, held in the spotlight, and still be permanently invisible. There is something that happens when you live inside a structure like that for long enough. It teaches the nervous system that full disclosure is dangerous, that being fully known carries risk, that the distance between who you are and who people think you are is not a problem to be solved. It's a condition to be managed. And the system learns that as reflex. The careful answer, the redirected question, the version of yourself that is warm and present and genuine, but always, always slightly edited. And here's what makes this so difficult to recognize later. When the external conditions change, the reflex remains. The work ends, the double life closes, the other name is retired. But the nervous system doesn't automatically unlearn what it practiced for years. It keeps doing what it learned to do, not because the need is still there, because the pattern is. So you move through the world, warm but slightly unreachable, present but slightly elsewhere. And often you don't know why, because from the inside it didn't feel like protection anymore. It just feels like who you are. This is exactly what identity level adaptation does. It removes the original context while keeping the response. A woman who learned to be unknowable for very good reasons continues being slightly unknowable long after those reasons are gone. Not because she chooses distance, because distance became the shape of the self. And when someone asks you, why don't you let people in? The honest answer is not a reason, it's a confession. I stopped knowing how. And before that, I stopped knowing I wasn't. So, what does it mean to understand this? It doesn't mean dismantling the identity. It doesn't mean becoming someone else. It means recognizing that what feels like character may also be consolidation. That the stability, the composure, the capacity to manage without being managed, the ability to light up a room while keeping yourself hidden, are real. And learned. Both things at once. And what is learned is not permanent, not fixed, not the ceiling of what's possible. Because here's what the system never had the condition to practice. Being known without consequence. Being seen without managing what gets seen. Being close to someone without a second name, without an edited story, without the quiet, continuous work of keeping the distance exactly right. That's not a personality trait. That's an absence of safety. An absence of safety is not the same as absence of capacity. The capacity was always there, underneath the efficiency, underneath the composure. Something that was there before all of that. Something that didn't disappear. Something that was simply set aside. And what is set aside can be returned to. The woman who was permanently invisible, even in the spotlight, was never actually gone. She was just waiting for conditions where being known felt safe enough to try. So, if you recognize yourself in what we described today, let that recognition be gentle, not corrective, not alarming, not something to fix immediately. Gentle. Because what we described today is not a flaw. It's the shape of an intelligent system that organized itself completely around what was required, around what was safe, around what was survivable, and did so successfully. In the next episode, we are going to look at what happens when that begins to shift. Not through force, not through dismantling, but through understanding what the system needs to learn something different. Because the range was not lost. The flexibility wasn't destroyed. The capacity for full experience was never gone. What was organized around efficiency can reorganize around something else. I'm Eva Valora. This was episode 4 of the first season of the Psychologist for Escorts podcast. What you carry for others has weight. Your body knows that. Give it a moment before you move on.